First of all, I want to ask you, how many of you lived in Montgomery County in the 1960s? Oh my. This is going to be a very difficult talk. I did not live in Montgomery County in the 1960s. I moved here in 1968, and so you need to be my faculty advisors. You listen to what I say. If I'm accurate, don't tell me that. But if I'm not accurate, do tell me that. And if there's areas of my talk that you feel should be defined in more detail in the future, because I'll give this again, please let me know. Do you know your assignments? Okay, let's get started. How Montgomery County changed in the 1960s. When I thought about that, I realized we need to put that in context. We need to talk about how the U.S. changed in the 1960s, because this was a very tumultuous decade. We had 4 presidents. We began with a Republican, we had 2 Democratic presidents, and we ended with a Republican. We had 3 assassinations. I don't think any decade in American history had those kinds of tragedies. We lost Kennedy, we lost Martin Luther King, and then we lost Robert Kennedy. And we lost, I think, our optimism. So it was a difficult time. It was a time of movements. We had the civil rights movement. We had the beginning of the women's rights movement. We had demands for equal access to public accommodations. We had demands for equal access to housing. How are the slides? Okay, good. We had demands to reduce poverty in pockets of white and black residents across the country. And let's look at some population figures. The United States grew by 13% in the 60s. We started about 180 million. We ended about 203 million. And I want to talk about the median income. In the 1960, white males made $5,572. Their salaries grew 70% in the 60s, and they made $94.47. Females made $3,377 in 1960, but they experienced a sizable increase to $5,536 by 1970. Black males were making $3,688, and at the end of the decade, they were making $6,435, which was a 75% increase. Not a lot of money, but still a salary increase, a growth. And also, black females started out at $2,289, and at the end of the 60s, they were making $4,500. I want you to keep that in mind, particularly the growth of salaries for black men and women, and also the percentage growth in the U.S. Now we get to the topic at hand. How did Montgomery County grow in the 1960s? I'm going to talk about these 6 topics in my talk, if I don't run out of time. So under demographics, we'll look at these 4 bullet points. Let's talk about population. Montgomery County grew 65% in the 1960s. The United States grew 13% in population. So we were still experiencing huge population growth. That was, in the 50s, we grew by 107%. We doubled our population. However, in the 60s, we actually added more residents than we added in the 50s. So we added 181,000 new residents in the 60s, and we added 176,000 in the 50s. And as we added new residents, we were adding white residents. So the percentage of black population in Montgomery County, which began in the 1940s about 10.5%, dropped in the 50s to 6.4%. It continued to drop down to 4% in the 60s, and at the end of the 70s, it was 4.1. It's my opinion that 1.1 increase in the percentage was the tipping point in the beginning of the increase in the black population in Montgomery County. We reached our lowest point at that in the 60s. Now let's look at the growth areas. In the 50s, there were 4 areas that grew a lot. I'm talking about the 50s: Wheaton, Rockville, Colesville, and Bethesda. Okay, now it's the 60s. What are the growth areas? Rockville, Colesville, Olney, Gaithersburg, and Potomac. The biggest percentage growth was Potomac. not biggest in terms of population or the number of houses they built, but it was an indication that the county growth and housing development was shifting west. It had been very heavy in the east county, in the Wheaton, and now it was shifting to the left. It's shifting north. We have Olney growing significantly. We have Gaithersburg growing significantly. And we have Rockville just booming. Rockville added 44,000 people in the 60s. They went from 37,000 residents to 80, 37? Yeah, 30,000 residents to 81. So Bethesda, where's Bethesda? Bethesda's down at, I have to look at this because my slides are here for me to see. Bethesda was stuck at 17% growth. What does that mean? I don't know. Honestly, I need to explore it, but I do think that there wasn't as much open land in Bethesda. There were country clubs, there were government buildings, there were lots of land that was already set aside, and maybe they weren't really interested in growing rapidly. They certainly did not like the kind of housing being built in the Wheaton area during the 50s. And so maybe Bethesda was trying to decide, how do we want to grow? Let's talk about employment and income in the 60s in Montgomery County. We had a workforce of 132,000 in 1960. It grew to 219,000 at the end of the decade. The most important things for me is that the number of employed white males grew by 112% in the 60s. And the number of white females grew by 172%. It's important to notice that there were more growth in female jobs than there were, are we on the same right slide? Than there were male jobs, white male jobs in the 60s. And then if you go down to the bottom and you look at median income, white males, of course, they got 78%. They're white males. They had almost doubled their salaries in the 60s, but there was significant growth, 143% growth in salaries for women from, what was it, 2119 in the 60 census to 5,000, more than 5,000 by the end of the decade. I think that's a reflection, in my mind, of the message of the women's rights movement, and more women were going back to pursue the careers they were educated to pursue, or to pursue the interests that they had developed over time. And we look at median income for black males and black females. Black males' income increased by 144%, and black males 144%, and black females 254%. And what does that mean? And I don't know for sure, but my hunch is that the wealth of the nation and the growing prosperity reflected in salary increases in the 60s, 50s and 60s, that finally employers were catching up. They knew the differential. They were finally catching up with the salaries for black men and black women, but they're still lagging significantly behind. Now, let's talk about the electorate in Montgomery County. We are a wealthy county. Only 31% of county residents had failed to go to college in the 60s. 31%. 28% had gone to college, 26% graduated, and 15% had done graduate work. We were a well-educated county. We had money. The average household income in 1966 was almost $20,000. Huge. We also had a lot of voters registered. In 1962, we had 128,000 voters, and by the end of the decade, we had 235,000 voters. And it's my calculation that 30% of the population of the county were registered voters in the 60s. I'm not sure that can be matched today. In fact, I'm fairly certain that that figure is not the figure that we see in the 80s. 37% of the residents were registered. Now let's move on to the idea. The county was previously run by a board of commissioners. They were appointed for a long time. I think they finally were elected, but all the major decisions were made in Annapolis. They could recommend major decisions, but they were made in Annapolis. And the voters in Montgomery County, many of whom were well educated, they were working for the government, they were involved in progressive programs, and they were tired of having to have Annapolis to tell the county what to do. So led by the League of Women Voters, specifically Stella Werner, and civic organizations and others, they in 48 passed a charter law that allowed the county to elect its own county council. Stella Werner was the first female elected to the council. And they had a lot of power. They are both legislators, and they had executive functions and legislative functions. And that worked for a little while. But in 1962, a campaign began to separate the legislative function from the executive function. And they wanted to be able to elect a separate county executive. Elect your county council, they make the laws. Elect your county executive, they run the county. And the reason for that is farmers, Republicans, some civic organizations, some other advocates, they couldn't get the ear of the county council. So they thought if we have two different offices we can go to, there's a chance that our voice will be heard. So they finally won in 1968, and in 1970 they elected their first county executive, Republican James Gleason. Now you need to know, prior to the election of Gleason in 70, we had Republicans and Democrats on our county council. Can you imagine? Do we today? No. Let's go on and talk about civic activism in the 60s. And the focus here is to see whether these national activities in civil rights and human rights were reflected in the behavior of activities in the county. There was a man named Alfonso Lee who was the president of the Rockville branch of the NAACP. He'd lived in Rockville a long time. He was tired of not being able to eat in restaurants. He was tired of not being able to rent or buy a home. So he, with two other associates, sent questionnaires to every eating establishment in Montgomery County. Now, back then, you could go in a drugstore, and they had a counter. You could sit down and eat. You could eat lunch, you could eat dinner, you could go out and eat breakfast. And they sent this questionnaire out, and they said, do you discriminate in serving customers? And 21 of them came back, and those are the ones without the yellow marker. They came back and said, no. 19 came back and said, yes. That was a big mistake. Alfonso turned the information over to the county NAACP, and they publicized it. Here's the ones who serve everyone. Here's the ones that don't serve everyone. And the ones that didn't serve everyone were either local chains like People's Drugs or Woodward and Lothrop Tea Room, or there were national chains that we're familiar with, like Drug Fair, Woolworths, W. Grant's, Hot Shops, and are we on the right slide? Yes. The yellow were the people that initially said, we discriminate in who we serve food to. And they're the ones who rapidly came back once it was publicized and said, oh, no, we've changed our policy. We don't discriminate anymore. So it was a very effective, not expensive, not aggressive effort on the part of the county NAACP. Boom, done. But, of course, there were holdouts. And there was a restaurant, a Western chain called High Boy, and it did not agree to serve everyone. And so the NAACP in the county picketed the High Boy, and there also in the crowd was a young man from Howard University. Can you hear me okay? And his name was Lawrence Henry. Lawrence Henry had been on the Freedom bus rides in the South. He came back to finish his studies at Howard. He was 27 years old. And he said, what I was doing in the South, I can do in Montgomery County. So in the crowd of picketers at the High Boy restaurant was Lawrence Henry, and you'll hear more about him. So they picketed, 25 people. The owner called the Montgomery County Police. They came and arrested all 25. Big mistake, because that activated all the churches, white and black churches, all of the civic organizations, all of the NAACP, and it brought in Lawrence Henry, not to be left out of anything. They picketed, and they also hand out a brochure to people on the sidewalk near the High Boy. Please do not use this restaurant. It does not serve everyone. Why don't you go to W.T. Grant's? They serve everyone. So it took a while for High Boy to decide to change their policy, but they did. But that was the beginning of the fight for public accommodations. How many of you went to Glanico Park when you were kids? Okay. Very popular destination for families and kids. Glen Park was the next focus of the fight for public accommodations. They did not admit whites. It was a private property, and they had a segregationist policy. But Lawrence Henry, man about town, decided that he would focus his energies on that. He brought 5 people of a group he created called the Nonviolent Action Group, NAG. Remember the 60s? Everybody had a little slogan. They were the NAGs. He shows up with 5 people at the Glen Echo Park entrance. 2 of those people created disturbance off to the side. The security guard goes over there, boom. The rest of them go and sit on the carousel ride. In comes the security guard. He says, we only allow whites in this facility. We need you to leave. And the students refused to leave, and they were arrested. And that arrest did just what the arrests at the Highboy did. The Bannockburn subdivision, which was right beside Glen Echo, very progressive, came out and they joined the picket lines with the NAACP and with Lawrence Henry. And they picketed they started in June. That's when they first got arrested. It closed in September. It did not change its policy. However, a resident of Bannockburn had just been appointed to a cabinet position in the Kennedy administration. He had a chance to talk to Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General. Robert Kennedy was offended, and he asked his people to look into it. And it turns out the trolley line that ran to Glen Echo was on federal property under a lease. So Kennedy said, "You discriminate? No lease. You have to get people to come out to your park in a different way." When the park opened in March, it was integrated. Another leader in the fight for, then we shifted to the fight for fair housing. Okay, public accommodations was done in Montgomery County because after the Glen Echo event, the county passed a public accommodations law, and it was the first in Maryland, and so that fight was over. So they moved on to fair housing, and the county had created a commission on human rights by that time, mid-60s, and you could come and testify in front of that commission. So Edith Throckmorten was the president of the NAACP chapter in Montgomery County. She went there and said, she said there are landlords, white landlords, who own property that rent to blacks in Rockville, and they're charging exorbitant rates. And then if they get an offer to buy their property, or they're evicting these tenants with no notice at all. And then the president of the Kengar Civic Association came to the commission, and he said, we have people that own their own houses, but if they go to a bank and ask for a home improvement loan, they get turned down. So they can't even improve their properties, and then the county comes and says, this is a dilapidated property, we're going to condemn it. So he said, why don't you create create a fair housing law so that these people can rent or buy in the county, but also why don't you create low-income housing programs around the county to allow these people to have homes. So that was the beginning of the fair housing issue. And that was the issue in the 1966 election. There was a guy named Mahoney was running for governor as a Democrat, and a guy named Spiro Agnew was running for government as a Republican. The guy that was running as a Democrat, Mahoney, had a slogan, a man's home is his castle. Well, that's a racist dog whistle. And the residents of Montgomery County knew that, and they voted for Spiro Agnew. And basically sent a message to the Democratic Party, if you put racist candidates on the ticket, we won't vote for them. Then in June, or maybe in July, the county council agreed to sit down and have 5 days of hearings on the fair housing law. And they were inside the county courthouse meeting and having testimony from the various groups that were for and against. And outside the courthouse were 5 days of protests asking for fair housing. And so at the end of the 5 days in July, they approved the Fair Housing Law in Montgomery County. And that was before the federal government approved the Fair Housing Act as part of the Civil Rights Act. So again, we were ahead of Maryland, but in this case, we were ahead of the nation. And then there were also efforts at community development. There were a series of communities throughout Montgomery County that were African-American communities. They were established post-Civil War. These former slaves came and they bought land, they built homes, they built a church, and they attracted families, and they were these independent but relatively isolated communities spread all around the county, basically focused on their church, and where they could raise the funds, focusing on schools that they would build. And one of the places was called Scotland on Seven Locks Road, and there was a matriarch in Scotland by the name of Geneva Queenie Mason, and she was concerned about the state of the community, but she was also mature, old, and she was getting ready to leave and live with her daughter in another state. She made friends with a woman from another subdivision, a white subdivision, Joyce Siegel, and together they decided to create SOS, Save Our Scotland. And they worked with the church in Scotland, and they worked with the residents. They tried to attract the power leaders in Montgomery County, and they succeeded. And as a result of that, and this is what Scotland looked like in the 60s. No dirt roads. They had electricity, dirt roads, no sewage, no water, no trash pickup. But they paid taxes to Montgomery County. And so they had, people would take their trash to the back of Scotland. There were 50 families in there. Now, let's say they came there in 1870, 1875. It was 1960. They weren't getting bank loans to repair their homes. They weren't making a lot of money. Their houses were old, unrepaired, and the county was talking about condemning them. At the same time, this was near Potomac, and developers were coming and buying the land from these individual families, and therefore breaking up the community. So the goal was to stop that and to save the community. And they petitioned. They went and put an application into HUD for a HUD grant, and it was the perfect timing because HUD was trying to show that it really was concerned about housing in areas other than urban locations around the country, that they cared about people, not just places. And so here is the Secretary Weaver of HUD walking through Scotland, and he approved government loans to Scotland. Phase 1 was to build townhouses, and Phase 2 was to build single-family homes for those families that had single-family homes in Scotland when they petitioned for this. Now, what's not talked about is everybody had to move out. All the residents had to move out. They cleared the whole place, and then they built these townhouses. This was Phase 1. So now they had sidewalks, they had plumbing, and they had recreation facilities, and here are some of the residents of Scotland, young residents, very pleased about their new community. Now, also in the 60s was a shift in how the county, well, first of all, a shift in how the federal government was thinking about planning for the future in the Washington area, and that stimulated and supported a shift in the thinking of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission about how to manage growth. Before, I think they sort of were catching up to a variety of subdivision applications in the 50s, tons of them, but now they looked ahead and said we ought to have the ability to shape the future. So in 1961, President Kennedy approved a plan called a Plan for the Year 2000 for the National Capital Region. And this was a federal plan. And you can see it was a plan that said that we want to build, here's the Capital Beltway on the inside here, and here's another beltway that was fortunately never built. The idea was, let's move automobile traffic around Washington, D.C., so it doesn't come in and congest it. But then let's build mass transit into Montgomery County and out here into Virginia and out here into Prince George's County to bring workers in and out of the city for jobs, but to reduce the dependence on cars. But that's also focused growth. Let's try to figure out these major corridors in PG County, Montgomery County, Fairfax County, Arlington County, and get them, and Alexandria, get them to focus on, concentrate their growth in corridors. So here's the Montgomery County corridor we're familiar with, but they were talking about a PG corridor up close to I-95 and others in the PG and into Virginia. So it was an ambitious plan, but it was a good idea. And in the conversation about that plan, they talked about wedges and corridors. For Montgomery County, the impact of that plan was they had to start thinking about just this corridor. This was them. What are we going to do? Are we going to be able to concentrate business and commercial and residential growth along this corridor? Are we going to be able to maintain a wedge of low density and agricultural used land as a buffer to this growth? And how will we plan for these two highways, I-495 and I-270? And geez, what's mass transit? You know, what are we going to do with that? So they came out with a document that, if you really heard Royce this morning, you need to go, this is Wedges and Corridors, the general plan for both Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and it was produced by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. This was a plan that aligned as well as it could with the year 2000 plan. The county was committing itself to put high-density growth in the corridors, low-density land use outside the corridors. They wanted to use wedges of land to protect stream valleys, parks, and agricultural land. They were going to build the inner beltway, and they were going to build I-270 and support that. This plan that came out in '62 made a bold projection. It said by 1980, this is what the county's going to look like. Lots of density over down here in top of the district in Bethesda and Kensington. Where is this? This is the Colesville area. But we're going to focus on Rockville, Gaithersburg, and Germantown. A little bit of growth over here in Damascus, and we expect it only will grow. So they had this projection. If they followed the plan in 1962 and implemented it, here's what the county would look like in 1980. So again, here's the projection. This is what they thought the county would grow in this direction by 1980. All these nodes of Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown, Damascus only. This is what they projected by 1980. This is what we have actually in 2015. Now, the most important thing is, sure, there were incursions into the wedge, the green wedge that was projected in '62, but we still have a green wedge. Here's the agricultural preserve. It arcs over the top of the county and comes down over here. We have concentrated growth along I-270, and all this white is residential and light commercial. But for the most part, in the big picture, Montgomery County made a plan in 1962 following a federal recommendation, and they executed the plan over more than 50 years. I'm not sure there's any other metropolitan suburb that has been so consistent in trying to adhere to what they originally thought was a good plan. In order for that plan to work, they had to have highways and they had to have mass transit. And these are the cars that you might have seen on the Beltway. These are cars that I wished I had when I was learning how to drive. And my father had a Rambler station wagon. I couldn't get a date. And if I got a date, I had to borrow my friend's cars, because a Rambler station wagon was not any of these. So in 1950, even before the year 2000 plan, the DOT came out with a projection of what they thought the highway plan should be in the future. So here, let's see what we got here. Here's our Beltway, okay, into Virginia. Here's, oh, I'm sorry. So what you see is the inner Beltway you see an outer beltway, you see I-270, you see I-270, you see this outer beltway crossing into the Potomac, crossing the Potomac River north of the American Legion Bridge. This outer beltway was never built. But if you get off I-270 onto Montrose Road and drive east, you're essentially driving on a section of what would have been the right-of-way of that outer beltway. And that is basically, it's facilitating west to east traffic, east to west traffic in Montgomery County. There was also in here in D.C., where is it? Yeah, right here. Here's this highway through the top of D.C., never built. But I think if you get on Military Road in Washington, D.C., that's essentially some of the right-of-way that would have been followed by this highway. So the Beltway opened on August 17th, 1964. Governor Tawes cut the ribbon. See all these people that are behind there. And then in the background are hundreds of cars that want to be the first one to drive on the Beltway when it opened. So this was the first Beltway traffic jam in history, right here. We see it. And here's what the Beltway looked like. I mean, if I could go up to the 270 split and there'd be one car going left and one car going right, I mean, my day's made. I mean, and on the right is what it looked like before it opened, 3 lanes in each direction with a earth median, which they were going to plant. Now, some of the roads they projected for this to be built were not built, and there was a projection for a north-central thruway. Originally, it was going to be coming down I-270, coming right through Bethesda and Rock Creek Park. Do you think that was acceptable to the wealthy people in D.C. and that area? No. So then they said, okay, we'll just move it east and it will come off the Beltway, so people coming down I-95 from Baltimore and I-270 can get on the Beltway, and then they'll hit this freeway through D.C. and cross the Potomac River. And that freeway was going to go right through the center of Tacoma Park and through Brooklyn and through Michigan Park. So cleverly, by this time, there were people that knew how to organize. Sammy Abbott was an activist in Tacoma Park. He created the Save Tacoma Park Committee. And Reginald Booker created the, what is it called? I can't think of it, but the Traffic Action Crisis Group in Brooklyn. They testified at every possible hearing, because every time they testified and said, we don't like it coming through in Tacoma Park, they said, oh, no problem. We're going to raise it up and it's going to go over Tacoma Park. No, we don't like that. Okay, we're going to dig under Tacoma Park and a big tunnel and have it come out somewhere in D.C. They said no. So eventually, by 1968, Maryland DOT and federal DOT said, we give up. And one of the things that Sammy Abbott and Reginald Booker said the whole time they testified was, we need mass transit. We don't need more highways. We need mass transit. The year 2000 plan says mass transit. It also says highways. All you're doing is building highways. Let's have the mass transit side. And so all the funds for that highway were shifted over to the WMATA, which had just been set up a year before that. And on their tentative plan was exactly what we have today. We have a red line with 7 stations going up on the west side of the loop, and we have the other side of the red line on the eastern side with 4 stations. Now, if you add Tacoma Park to that, you have 5 stations on the east side, because Tacoma Park is accessible from Silver Spring and Tacoma Park, Maryland. And if you add Shady Grove to the west side, you get 8 stations. And the reason Shady Grove was added is Rockville said, we love a station. We are not going to be the rail yard for the terminus of WMATA. So they caved on that. Now let's talk about housing. In the 50s, single-family residences. Did I mention single-family residences? And a few apartments. By the 60s, there were both pressure from developers and reasons to look a little more favorably on apartments. So the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning and the Montgomery County Planning Board had created zoning that said, yeah, you can build apartments, but you have to put it on a small footprint. And so you have to go up. And go up costs money. And so only people who are willing to invest in luxury apartments were going to build apartments in Montgomery County, which meant you were attracting high-income people. So here's the Grosvenor Park apartment built in 1964. Here's the Irene apartment built in Friendship Heights, named for Abe Poland's wife. And here's the Washingtonian Tower, that was built by Sam Eig in 1964 in Gaithersburg, right up where the Shady Grove Music Fair was. Sam Eig was way ahead of development. He said, someday this is going to be a very, very busy place, and he built this high-rise tower. He lived at the top. He had the ability to go out on the roof and look around, and he kept on looking around. There was nothing being built. But have you been to Rio? Have you been to the new Crown? Sam Eig was right. You can't even see Sam Eig's tower apartment building anymore for all the work that's occurred. But let's go back and talk about apartment building in Montgomery County. So they built 2,100 apartments in 1940. That was only 10% of all the residences they built. They built 7,500 more in 1950. That was only 16% of all the residences built. They built 15,000 and more, and that was only 16+% of residences. And then in the 60s, they built 47,000 apartments. Well, obviously, we're tilting towards apartments. No, that was only 30% of all the residences built in the county in that decade. If you looked at the whole metropolitan area in 1962 and 63, 80% of all the new residences in the rest of the metropolitan area were apartments. So although we were getting apartments, 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes left. We were not building too many of them. And then there was another activity in housing. The Planning Board and the National Capital Planning Commission wanted to have communities built that were just more than houses and driveways, and in which the county had to try to provide all the services. They wanted builders to come in and build communities. They wanted housing, they wanted recreation facilities, they wanted retail and commercial. If you look up the road to Columbia, they wanted jobs, they wanted major employers. That was a very tough thing to accomplish. So the two major examples of that were Reston in Virginia, which did not ever have jobs, a big employer, and Columbia, Maryland, outside Baltimore, which did have a major employer and was able to fill in check that box off. And in Montgomery County, we had a very ambitious family. They were the Kettlers. They built many of the subdivisions in the 50s and the 60s, but they were ambitious and they were smart. They saw the year 2000 plan, they saw the general plan in 62, and they said, they're coming to Gaithersburg. I-270 goes close to Gaithersburg. Let's build a planned community. They were able to assemble 2,200 acres of farmland near Gaithersburg, and they projected it, and they planned to build a 20,000 resident community. Right off, you would go across Montgomery Village Avenue, and there's that lake right away, and that's where they built their first homes. Clarence KETTLER and architect George AUBIN were the leaders of that, as was Milton KETTLER. And I have a quote up here of him talking to the Gaithersburg Chamber of Commerce saying, hey, don't worry, this is really good. And so here's, in their first subdivisions, here's what Montgomery Village looked like. That original lake you see when you come in had houses around it. This is Lake Whetstone. They built a pool and recreation facility right beside it. They built another subdivision in the early days called Goshen Side, and you can see the emergence of the neo-colonial coming back. Remember the 50s, not much colonial or traditional. Well, this was the hint. It's coming, and it's coming back and, for real. And then they also built townhouses for sale, and this is the clusters of Stedwick, and they sold for about $30,000. Another planned community was of a different type. There was a clever guy out in California, and his name was Ross Cortez. And he had looked at the demographics of the nation. He said, they're getting older, and they have money. So they might be ready to sell the house they raised their families in and move to someplace fun. And so he created these Rossmore Leisure Worlds. He built 6 of them in California. He went to Switzerland and built one. He came back to the United States and looked at Montgomery County with its large population and high level of income. Wolf von Eckert of the Washington Post, a respected architectural critic, he loved it. Said it was the most significant residential housing since World War II. So every one of them has this globe. This is the iconic Leisure World globe. You go to California, there they are, right near Seal Beach is one of them. You go to Switzerland, there's the globe. And here's the, you see the plan for the community. They had an arc of residential apartment and other residential areas around a super huge golf course. They had swimming pools, and they had parks and walking paths. And this is right on Georgia Avenue, right between Beltway Road on the south and Norbeck Road on the north. The initial offerings were a duplex villa, one level. One family lived at one end, one family lived at the other. They're still there and selling very well. They also had single-family homes that they sold. They had townhouses that they built. And I want you to note that the roof of the townhouses, that's a mansard roof. That was big in the 60s and the 70s, and then, poof, you don't see it anymore. And they had a shopping center. So they had put together all the things that they needed to meet the needs of their new residents. And they slowly built out Leisure World. It was a success in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, 2000s, and now 2010s. And it's probably going to, if you go there, they've refurbished and rebuilt new apartments. It's a success. That's the end. Thank you very much.